So working through how to defend our faith, one of the most popular views that we have to work against to try and show people the truth of the gospel is the idea of atheism, that there is no God. So to be able to do that, proving that God exists can be very helpful in our present culture. So to that end, there are a number of different proofs for God's existence that we can go to just on a philosophical level to provide some argumentation, some validity for his existence. The other thing that this is helpful for is when you're teaching teenagers and helping train them for how to deal with objections to the faith, and maybe if they end up with some atheist professor, these kinds of arguments can come in really handy because they provide a really solid philosophical basis that even if the atheist can, do a pretty good job of making arguments, they really struggle to come up with sufficient explanations for these different arguments. So to that end, we hit the cosmological argument. So this is really the idea that to go to philosophy to prove that God exists by looking at the existence of the universe. So if the universe exists, we should expect a sufficient cause for the universe. So that's why it's called the cosmological argument, because it's an argument based on the existence of the cosmos. Next is the Kalam cosmological argument, and that's a much simpler syllogism, but it still packs a really strong punch. The idea behind that one is that everything had a beginning to its existence, and that is something atheists will agree with. And then if you want to say that, well, then everything that begins to exist, it has to have a cause. Then you go to how the universe actually began to exist. Therefore, we know that the universe had a cause. So this is a simpler syllogism. It's much easier, more simple to argue for. And from that, you can then begin to reason toward the God of the Bible. The teleological argument, we hit that one recently. Someone who has been really influential in this area is a gentleman by the name of Stephen Meyer. He appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast and talked for almost 3 hours about the evidence of God's existence from design. So this is the teleological argument, or the divine watchmaker. The idea behind that one is if you're wandering in some wilderness plain and you stumble across a pocket watch, when you begin to inspect all of the design that went into the pocket watch, you would not assume that watch happened without a designer. So then when you go and you look at other things that also have the indications that they were designed, things like DNA, which is the most complex digital code in existence, or you go and you look at the universe and how the planets are all aligned, and how the Earth is in this special Goldilocks zone, where it's protected from space debris, where it's protected from solar radiation, where it's close enough to be warm, but far enough away not to overheat, but not so close that it burns up. This very special place that the Earth is in the whole cosmos gives it a very unique condition where life can exist. So that kind of fine-tuning would be part of the teleological argument. And then we talked about the Leibnizian argument. So this would be, I think a lot of philosophers actually call it the contingency argument. Anything that is contingent has to have a sufficient cause. So when you go through and you look at anything that is contingent, everything depends on something else for its existence. Like, you can't just have an island without volcanic activity blowing rock out on top of the ocean, collecting sand, beginning to develop soil, providing ash for plants to then grow in. All of that had to have some cause, and it's all contingent on something else happening. So this would be the argument that everything is contingent, except for an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present God. So unless you have the God of the Christian philosophers, without that God, you cannot have anything in existence. So that would be the Leibnizian or the contingency argument. And then that brings us back up to the ontological argument. So we're working with this idea that we have to have a reason for why God exists, and then how do we know that God does exist? Toward this end, we're trying to be prepared for how to defend our faith, how to provide a reason for the hope that lies within. So the ontological argument lends itself very well to that, because not only is it a good argument, but it's really hard to argue against. The only trouble is it's so high and lofty in its argumentation that I really struggle with this one, and it is just hard for people to grapple with. Because of its complexity, most people will just brush it off as not being real consequential. They kind of brush off the ontological argument. But when it comes down to it, the greatest philosophers have not been able to really disprove this argument. Because think of the way to say this, it's an argument that can easily be brushed off because it's so complicated. But when you try to find a reason why it's wrong, you actually can never find any kind of a concrete reason to disprove the ontological argument. So the complexity makes it hard to really use, but its complexity is also very watertight, so that the atheists and the materialists can't really argue against it effectively. So rather than working through the whole argument again, the way we did last week, I have found this video that William Lane Craig had put together that does a really good job of explaining it, and we'll just kind of work through the video. It's only about 4 minutes long, but we'll pause along the way to discuss some of the points that the guy makes. So, to that end, here we go.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist.
So this is like the foundation of the argument, right? And there's a whole lot of ways that people try to sideline this argument, but we'll get into some of those counter-arguments as we go.
Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world.
So the basic foundation behind this is the God that we believe in, right? Someone who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. For God to lose any one of those traits, if he was not all-powerful, then he would not be maximally great. If God were not all-knowing, the same thing, it would break down. He would have limitations in his knowledge. And we can say, well, what God did wasn't the right choice because he was not fully aware of all the circumstances. Well, God, in fact, does know all the circumstances. And then being morally perfect. This is where a lot of materialists struggle with the idea of God because they want to go back to the problem of evil and say, well, if there's evil in the world, if there's suffering, then that means God must be evil. I can read the Old Testament and see where God commanded wars to happen, and I've decided that war is evil, and so I'm going to say, by commanding this war to happen, God is evil. And they'll make these arguments to try and tear down the idea of who God is. The problem with what they're doing is when they begin to argue against the existence of God, they're arguing against a God that is not, in fact, the God we believe in. They're arguing against a straw man. So they're making up a different kind of God than the God of the Bible. They're making up a different kind of God than the God we would argue for. If they want to argue that, I can't believe in God because he's evil, I would say, well, yeah, I don't believe in that God either. We're talking about totally different gods. The God I believe in is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect.
You're talking about Zeus.
Right. They're arguing for some kind of a Zeus that gets drunk and is promiscuous and just gets angry at people and throws lightning from the sky.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the God we believe in, right?
Right.
So it's a totally different paradigm. So to that end, this idea of the ontological argument, it's dealing with the concept of something to be maximally great. First, it has to be able to exist in a possible world. But for it to be truly maximally great, it has to exist in every real world. So to that end, we'll continue with the video.
Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist.
Does that argument make sense? So for something to exist in a possible world, it has to be a logically coherent idea. You can't have things that are impossibilities in a possible world. So a maximally great being who is evil does not exist because that's not a maximally great being. To have a maximally great being who is a unicorn doesn't work because unicorns have limitations even as an imaginary being. That unicorn is limited by time and space. So to that end, it's not a maximally great being. And there's a number of different ways that you can use this argument to try and grapple with the accusations of the atheists. He's going to get into the idea of a maximally great pizza, but the problem with a maximally great pizza is it's limited by time, by space. It's not a personal being. It's not all-powerful. You get into a lot of the details of who God is, and trying to make an argument that this maximally great pizza exists because I imagine it to exist doesn't work because a pizza has limitations. And as you begin to ascribe all the attributes to the pizza, eventually it ceases to be a pizza at all, and we come down to the God of Christian philosophy, the God who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and morally good. So we'll keep going on the video.
So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists.
So we'll just pause for a minute. We can think about that one. For a being to be maximally great, he can't just exist in possible worlds. He would have to exist in the actual world, right? So it's not saying that just because you imagine it exists, it does exist. Instead, this is really leaning back towards the idea of contingency versus necessity. Because everything that exists is that we know in the material world is not maximally great, there has to be a sufficient cause behind it. So if you can imagine a world in which there is a maximally great being, then it would have to be that that maximally great being would have to be the sufficient cause for all of the contingent things in the universe around us. So he is a necessary being as God, but everything else is contingent upon his existence. Toward that end, the argument here is that for a maximally great being to exist simply in a possible world would limit his greatness. But for him to be truly great, he would not just exist only in a hypothetical. Instead, he needs to exist in reality.
Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument.
The ontological argument can be broken down really into these 6 steps. Number 1, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. I don't think anyone can really argue with that. I think the atheist types would even concede this point. It is possible, they just don't believe that it's probable. Number 2, a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Okay, they'll probably concede that point. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And this is where they really like to jump in and provide counter-arguments. They'll say things like, well, for a maximally great unicorn, I believe that it would exist in every possible world, so therefore unicorns do exist in our actual world. Or they'll say the same thing about a maximally great island, which is the argument that we talked about that Marmoteurs argued for. We talked about that last week for the maximally great island that he believed existed. There's different ways that they try and make this argument, but truly for it to be fair to Anselm's argument, these beings would have to be maximally great. And maximal greatness requires being all-present, all-powerful, and completely moral. Well, a unicorn is limited by space simply by being a unicorn. A pizza is not personal, so therefore it is not a maximally great being. So even if you want to try to make the world's greatest pizza, it's still not going to be a maximally great being. So that's where their counter-arguments really fall short of even addressing Anselm's argument. But if we keep going, we get to the 4th step. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. And because the atheists have already objected to point 3, they're not really going to get so far as point 4. So I don't think they're not going to concede point 3, so they're not even going to have an opinion on point 4. They won't get that far. Point 5, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. They would object to that. Therefore, a maximally great being does exist. So this is just taking a lot more labor to get every single point of the argument in there. And really, the crux of this argument is going to be that 3rd point. But let's see what this guy has to say.
Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor, or a square circle, or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies? It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God.
So does that make sense? A maximally great pizza is not a logically coherent concept. So just like a married bachelor or any kind of a paradox, something that can't exist in the actual world, well, a maximally great pizza can't exist in this world. Because even if you make the world's greatest pizza, well, maybe it could have been a little bit bigger. Maybe it could have fed more people. Maybe more people could have enjoyed it. And so there are possible worlds in which this is not the greatest, the maximally great pizza, the greatest possible pizza. So does that make sense? A pizza can't be the greatest possible being because it doesn't fit the criteria for the greatest possible being. Exactly. Yep.
All powerful, all of those things aren't necessarily subjective.
Which is where this is an idea we worked through a lot with our counseling series, where currently the advice and counsel that you'll get from psychologists is going to be contingent on a world in which there is no absolute truth. They don't believe in absolute truth. They believe everything is subjective, and everyone can have their own ideas about things. Well, maybe that's true for you, but it's not true for me. But for this kind of an argument to work, you have to be in a world with absolute truth. And so by trying to make everything subjective, they don't even have to grapple with this idea because they don't believe that there is anything transcendent. There is nothing that is true beyond our own experience. So what's true for you is different than what's true for me.
About where communism can exist. You know, there's only two places, pretty close together. But in our world it doesn't.
Yeah.
In hell where they already have it, in heaven where they don't.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just backed up by the recent Jubilee video with Patrick Bet-David. Oh, it's a really good video because he sits down with 20 atheists, and each of them gets an opportunity to come and debate with him.
Are these kids or are they?
They're mostly popular influencers.
Oh.
Yeah, so a lot of them, some of them are teenagers, a lot of them are older YouTubers, that kind of thing. But they sit down with Patrick Bet-David, and they're like, well, communism is the way to go. And he's like, no, capitalism is. And they go back and forth. But the thing that all the communists agreed is that no one has done communism properly. Yeah, if you do it the way it's supposed to be in some possible world, then it would work well in the actual world. But because it's a logically incoherent idea, it doesn't actually work. So even in that way, there are a lot of other things beyond just your concept of God that break down based on these criteria. It's not logically coherent. It can't possibly happen.
On the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
So there you go. I feel like that's a much more interesting way to review what we went over last week. And hopefully that makes the argument a little bit more accessible for us. If God could exist in a possible world, then that means that God does actually exist. Simply the idea of God himself is an intuitive idea, meaning you can talk to anyone in any culture about God and they know an idea of what you're talking about. Now, they're not going to know the details of who he is until you teach him, but that is why God revealed himself to us in Scripture. He provides us with the truth of himself so that we can know him and we can teach him to others. And then they can have the salvation that comes through believing in him. So hopefully that was helpful and made the ontological argument a little bit more accessible. The really big thing to remember for this one is that It doesn't matter if you can make the argument yourself. It's just helpful to know that it exists. So if you run into someone who's really skeptical, who's talking circles around you, who they may seem like they're really intelligent and so they must be right. Well, these arguments are out there that the atheist types really can't refute. And so you can have confidence knowing that just because you don't necessarily have the ability to grapple with their argument, it doesn't mean that there aren't other really smart Christians who can counter those types of arguments. So that it does a lot to help bolster our faith, knowing that our faith is reasonable, it is coherent, it is logical, and there are people who have really long-standing arguments that have not been refuted. Anselm made this argument it's been over 900 years ago since Anselm, and nobody has really done a great job of refuting this. Most people who are going to refute the ontological argument, they're going to refute Descartes' view of the ontological argument, which is a little different, and I don't even know how to explain Descartes' version. But Anselm's is older and a whole lot more sturdy, where men like Kant, who tried to grapple with the ontological argument and disprove the idea that God does exist because of his nature in ontology, well, Kant is actually refuting Descartes and not Anselm. So if you want a really good logical argument, go all the way back to Anselm and work with his idea, because that's the one that has not been refuted. So we'll keep going through the outline here. Basically, the ontological argument, it's attributed to Anselm and Descartes especially. Descartes' argument was a little weaker, but it's looking at God as the greatest conceivable being, or the maximally great being. And for it to be maximally great, you have to fall back on this idea that a being that exists in reality is going to be greater than a being that only exists in your mind. So if you can only imagine him, well, then he's not actually maximally great. So you have to go back to saying that God does exist in the actual world, therefore he does exist in reality. So here's where we kind of break from the ontological argument. We'll move on to the conclusion. In these arguments from cosmology, we have seen how the universe must have a sufficient cause, an ultimate beginning or first cause, a greatest conceivable being that exists in the imagination and in reality, an intelligent designer, as well as a necessary explanation for existing that lies beyond itself. Taken together, the cosmological, teleological, Leibnizian, and ontological arguments converge to point not only to a first cause or designer, but to an eternal, self-existent, personal God of Christian theism who is revealed in Scripture and supremely in Jesus Christ. Now, to get to that last sentence, that he is the God revealed in Scripture, this is where the classical argument for the existence of God has to have the second step. So you start with step one, and you say that God does exist, and then step two, you move on to arguing, well, what is that God like? How do we know this God? How has he made himself known to us? So that's going to be really tied together with our step two, which we will begin next week. So integrating these arguments, each of the classical proofs, the cosmological argument, the teleological, Leibnizian, and ontological, each offers a unique lens to understand God's existence. So it's not that one of these is true and the others are not, or that we only need one of these arguments. Each one of the arguments shows a different facet of God. We can see a different part of him through these arguments, and hopefully, simply by studying the arguments, we can actually get to know God better and also be able to provide a better argument for his existence to those who would be skeptical that he is real. While these different approaches handle the question from various angles, they converge on one common truth, that the universe itself points to a creator. So that's why all of these fall under the big umbrella of cosmological arguments. When it comes down to it, the things that we see in the world around us, whether it's morality, whether it's the fact that everything exists, whether things that exist have to have a sufficient cause, the sufficient cause being the greatest conceivable being. All of these different arguments come back to the one idea that God does exist. So this is where our faith and our reason can work together. Christian theism holds that God is not only the ultimate cause of the universe, but also the personal, relational God revealed in Scripture. So when you see these different philosophical arguments for God, really, if you go back to the ontological idea of a greatest conceivable being, for him to be the greatest conceivable being, you end up coming down to the God of the Bible. Not only is he all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect, like the video talked about, but in addition to that, being morally perfect means that he cares about every individual. He cares about you and I. For him to be all-knowing and all-powerful, that means he has to understand how the natural order works, because he made all of those things. He set the planets in their courses. He gave us the stars to rule the night. He made a cause and effect world where if I tell lies, then people don't trust me. And if people don't trust me, then I can't have quality relationships. And if I can't have quality relationships, then I have emotional depression. Well, all of this comes down to things that really can be very relevant even for counseling. Where in our counseling class we saw how when you're living against those principles that God has taught, it makes you uncomfortable. It makes warning bells go off, and it gives you signs that you're not living well in the world. And if you respond well to those indicators, it should point you back to the God who set everything up to work a certain way. But all of these things, when we have faith, that can help point us to the proper mode of reason. And when we have really sound, logical, solid reasoning, that should lead us back to our faith. And so it's kind of a symbiotic relationship where the two bolster each other and give us confidence to go out into the world and share the gospel with folks, knowing that even if I come across a really sharp atheist who can beat me down with great argumentation, well, I know that there are ideas out there that he can't actually answer. He can't explain why in the world we have this extremely complex computer code at the core of every cell in the billions of cells that exist in our body. How do we have that much complex information that just happened by random chance? Well, it's not by random chance. When you have that kind of a design, you have to have a designer. And so just simply looking at science and the world around us points us to the God of all creation. And that's why theology in classical education, theology has been considered the chief of the sciences, because God is able to be studied and he has made himself known. And when you have a true, maximally great, loving God, well, then it makes it possible for us to even endeavor to study the world and embark on the process of scientific exploration, because we have a consistent God who made everything, who made it with consistency. So therefore, we can study it. We can see things that are observable, measurable, and repeatable. And even things that are recorded in Scripture. Just because we can't create everything with a word, we have a God who could do it again, so it's repeatable. He recorded it for us, therefore what he did is measurable, and we can observe the creation that he made around us, so it is observable. So even the creation account that's in Scripture truly is scientific, but we just cannot reproduce the act of creation because we are not the maximally great being. But God could. Another big point for this, all of these different concepts all point back to God, because God is both necessary and he is also personal. So these arguments from contingency and necessity, which would be the Leibnizian and the ontological argument, show that God's existence is not dependent on the universe. He is eternal and self-existent. Our teleological and cosmological arguments reveal that God is wise, and powerful as the Creator, pointing toward his purposeful design and how he has made himself accessible to us, being a personal God. Then, if he is a personal God who is involved with us personally, well, then he must have revealed himself to us in some way. One aspect of that revelation that he gives us is Scripture itself, but then another aspect of his self-revelation is the person and work of Christ. So Christ is the fulfillment of so much of these arguments. Beyond demonstrating God's existence, Christian theism identifies Jesus Christ as the ultimate revelation of God. The universe testifies to God's power and order, but the gospel testifies to his love, redemption, and personal relationship with humanity. And this is where we're going to get into a lot more of this next week, where we go into the evidence for Christian theism, the evidence that God did become a man, and in the incarnation of Christ we see the fullness of God. We'll be able to go and examine the evidence for that through the step 2 of the classical approach to apologetics. And step 2 of the classical approach is also our evidential approach to apologetics. How can we use this today? What makes it practical? How can we use it in our lives? The application for believers helps us when we understand that these proofs strengthen our confidence in God's existence, and it equips us to defend our faith. So we can have confidence that God does exist, and if you really do dive into these arguments, if you learn how to argue for these different syllogisms, while it is technical, it can be helpful for arguing about beliefs, about faith. So it can be helpful in the evangelistic endeavor if you get really good at using these arguments. And the way that you, was it last week, right? You were talking about how the more heady idea of a greatest conceivable being is something that you actually have used in evangelism, right?
Yeah.
So the way you did it was argue first through teleology, right? You start with design and say that
I don't use the fancy terms, but I guess, yeah.
everything has the design in the world, right? And then if it's been designed, it had to be designed by the greatest possible being.
And even when you do the infinite regress, there's got to be something back there.
It leads you back to God. So that's a way that I hadn't thought of before to really make it super practical and make it effective in an evangelistic conversation. And you did a great job of that. I appreciate it. It helped me realize that these things are more useful than I thought they might have been. Yeah.
And sometimes when I look through all of them, they all basically come down to the idea that there is a beginning. There is a beginning, no matter which one you're using. And so making it more practical in that. Philosophers like studying moving lost in usually. But if we back up, they all just say there is a start, there is a
And I think the ontological argument is necessary because whichever approach you take to proving God does exist, once you have the ontological argument, you can prove what kind of God exists. So all the other arguments are a whole lot more concrete and easier to grapple with. If you have design, you have to have a designer. If you have a watch, you have to have a watchmaker. That's easy to...
But why is the watchmaker good?
Right. How do we know his character? How do we know he's personal? And for those things, you really need the ontological argument.
We can conceive what a good person looks like, no matter where you are. You know, if you're down in Brazil, you know what a good person looks like. You might think it's a weak person, and they get beat up a lot or something, but there's still that strength there that you would admire no matter who you are. So yeah, having that for the argument of good God. We desire a good God.
We do.
So therefore, there must be the possibility of God. No matter who that person is.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So this is really, it's really useful for believers because that helps us argue for our faith. So A, it gives us confidence, and then B, it helps us to be able to share the gospel with others. So for the Christian, observing the universe, contemplating design, reflecting on necessity should not lead only to an intellectual assent, right? We don't just say, wow, this is really cool in my head. But in practicality, in reality, this should lead me to worship that God. If he is so great and personal and loving, well, I'm going to be happiest, I'm going to be the most fulfilled in life when I am worshiping at his feet. So it leads us to worship, obedience, and trust in the God who created and sustains all things. Our closing thoughts. The cosmos around us is not silent. It declares the glory of God. When we see the order, the beauty, necessity embedded in creation, we are invited not merely to acknowledge a first cause, but to know and follow the personal God revealed in Jesus Christ. So this is where it brings us to step 2. First, we see that God does exist. And then in step 2, the next part of our apologetic endeavor is going to be to prove that God is the God of the Bible. So God exists. He has these personality traits. Now, what world religion accounts for all of those traits of God? Is the God of the Muslims all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing? Well, if he's all-knowing, then he has to be able to tell the future, right? But when you look at the prophecies in the Quran, those prophecies don't come true. When the Bible gives you the test of a false prophet, and Muhammad says, well, when you have questions and you don't understand the Quran, go back to the older scriptures. He's talking about the Torah. And if he's talking about the Torah, that includes the test of a false prophet. And when you include the test of a false prophet, it refutes Muhammad as a prophet of God. So if you're staying consistent with any system, that the evidence of Scripture points you back to not the God of the Mormons, not the God of the Muslims, not the God of the Buddhists, not the All-Mother that they have. Instead, what we come down to is the personal, loving God of the Bible. So hopefully next week will be a lot less philosophical. It'll be less heady. We'll get out of the weeds and the kelp on this one. And instead we'll be able to get down to just really hard evidence. We have to look at some archaeology, be able to look at some history, and be able to look at the evidence within Scripture. So that'll be more fun. Huh?
It's just not going to be Tim Chalice, right?
No, we won't be doing Tim Challies. But it will be good. We'll have fun.